Thank you for coming. I've entitled this brief little talk, Myth, Imagination, and Faith, the Enduring Legacy of the Inklings, in 20 minutes. To begin with, let me observe that they themselves, the Inklings, were lovers of story. They loved to read them, they loved to hear them read, and they loved to write them. And as for writing, they could all, by all accounts, write a ripping good story. So one of their enduring appeal is the fact that they were lovers of stories themselves. But there was something more, and it is that more that I want to highlight here this morning. And I want to begin with an observation that I made reading some years ago an interview with Neil Gaiman. And Gaiman, in this interview, mentioned the fact that as he grew up and as in his reading experience, he read the Chronicles of Narnia and loved them. They awakened something within him and a longing. But later, when he found out that what Lewis was doing, in part, was sort of channeling the Christian understanding of things through them, he fell out of favor with them as a result, because he just felt that was wrong. Now, just a little bit later in that interview, when asked, what are you trying to do in your work? He said, well, in part, I'm trying to reflect something of what I understand to be the meaning and truth of the universe, as it were. And I thought to myself, didn't he get the disconnect there? I mean, because that's what Lewis was doing. He really believed that. What he failed to perceive is that all writers in some way mirror their own understanding of things. Now, one of the contributions that these Inklings made was in the area of what we call myth. As a genre of literature, myth has functioned and continues to function as a meta-narrative, as a story, if you will, under which people live and order their lives. They give our everyday lives meaning by providing a narrative that gives answers to those enormous riddles that torment us. Why do we exist? Where do we come from? Who or what is in control? Why are things the way they are? And how shall we then live? Myths have been humanity's constant companions from the beginning, and with the exception of the secular West, which I'm going to focus on here in a moment, they continue to be so. So why is the West an exception? And I'm talking about here Western Europe and North America. About 300 years ago, it lost its myth. That basically is the answer. Or as the theologian Robert Jensen has so aptly put it, it lost its story. Perhaps better, it was hijacked by them. For the exact title of Jensen's essay was How the World Lost Its Story. Clearly, as I've already observed, the majority world has not lost its story. Rather, a small band of brothers in the West, beginning about 300 years ago, as I noted, began to think that possibly the human story had been wrong about itself. Perhaps there was no story above the human story, that we are all alone in the universe, that there was no meta-narrative by which to steer the human narrative, and there never has been. Well, to make a long and very complicated story short, not long after the stage of perhaps, possibly this is true, came the dogmatic declaration that all meta-narratives were in fact nothing more than wish fulfillment. To put it another way, once come of age, modernity stood up and stated that humanity had been wrong about its own story. We are alone in the universe. There is nothing out there by which to steer our lives, and the sooner we all accept this fact, the better off we'll all be. Now, I've used just recently, this quote, but to sort of put flesh and bones on this idea, I want to use a quote that comes out of a letter of Virginia Woolf to her sister, just after she found out that T.S. Eliot, who had just come to visit her and tell her that he'd become a Christian. And this is what she said to her sister. "I have had a most shameful and distressing interview with poor dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic, believes in God and immortality, and he goes to church. I was really shocked. A corpse would seem to me more credible than he is. I mean, there's something obscene in the living person sitting by the fire believing in God." And this had become axiomatic. Not only did they pronounce, these Illuminati of modernity pronounce all meta-narratives dead, but they also began an aggressive enterprise to re-mythologize the human story to their own way of thinking through art, music, and literature. The results we're all familiar with: a body of art that is dark, brooding, solemn, hopeless, cheerless. I was so glad that when I picked up Albert Camus' The Stranger, much of my story had been reinstated. One of the most brilliant books I've ever read, and yet one of the most haunting and hopeless books I've ever read. Now, Danny Gableman has recently highlighted a direct connection between the negative attitudes to lightness and levity in general in the late 19th century to the present, and the negative attitudes among literary critics to literature, and fantasy literature in particular, during this period. And he traces its source, interestingly enough, to the Enlightenment rationalism. Quote, "The Enlightenment emphasis on reason and rationality led to a different sort of solemnity, but one which was similarly destructive to a spirit of levity. According to Frederick Inklings, in the Age of Enlightenment, cognitive reason became the yardstick of all that existed. Philosophers set reason as a lonely monolithic throne, denigrating tradition and religion as superstitious, and eschewing laughter and merriment as manifestation of humanity's self-incurred immaturity. From her lofty position, reason then identified categorical imperatives and mandated solemn duties which everyone had to perform without the help of humor or enjoyment. Laziness and cowardice were the only possible reasons for people not engaging in the serious and solemn business of becoming autonomous individuals." I'm reminded recently of a book I've started to read by Roger Scruton, where he talks about the reason we have alcohol is it's the only way to make life bearable. Now, what this did, as much as anything, was to exacerbate the unbearable truth of our aloneness. Paul Tillich captured this mood in stark prose as well as anyone I'm acquainted with. Aloneness, he says, is more true of man than any other creature. He is not only alone, he also knows that he is alone. And aware of what he is, he asks the question of his aloneness. He asks why he is alone and how he can triumph over being alone. For this aloneness he cannot endure. Now, Tillich has noted, accentuated this sense of our aloneness, and with this came a sense of hopelessness. In assessing the mood of modern literature in the 1960s, Tillich also observed that of the three states of mind reflected in current artistic expression, hopelessness, foolish hope, and genuine hope, hopelessness by far prevailed, while artistic interpretations of genuine hope were rare. Now, commenting on this observation of Tillich, Gabriel Thacker, a theologian from Andover Newton, a number of years ago, observed this, and with this, a transition to the Inklings. Thacker: "For a long time, we have assumed that that art is the most sensible barometer of the worlds of an era, or the winds of an era. If Tillich is right in his diagnosis, either today's new wave of hope is illusory, or the art community is not yet caught up with contemporary reality. Or it may well be that the artistic weather vane must be sought on otter-looking barns, where the conventional wisdom does not hold sway. There would be a nice bit of artistic irony if the best art of an era were born in the unlikeliest of places, let us say in some philologist's library, instead of a left bank cafe, and had to do with the unlikeliest of material, let us say of elves and ents, rather than ids and angst. And indeed, we here nominate Oxford Don J.R.R. Tolkien with his Hobbit world as a literary candidate for the cadre of modern hopers. Now, I want to just insert here that in the 60s, late 60s, I was a long-haired, goofy hippie who was searching desperately for meaning, something to hold on to. And the world that I was inherited outside had nothing. But I remember being introduced to Tolkien and to Middle-earth and to a narrative that was full of hope. And I was not the only one. In America especially, it was amazing what Tolkien did. What Thacker was pointing out is the fact that by the 1960s, modernity's mythology had become bankrupt and left us alone, deserted us. George MacDonald noted clear back in 1901, he says, "We live now among poets who cannot conceive of the universal power containing any larger feelings than their own. They cannot imagine, in the tremendous words of Dante, the love that drives the sun and all the stars, for the loves of which they write would not even drive thistledown." More recently, modernity's doctrine, Alexander Solzhenitsyn observed and lamented, had by the 1960s succeeded in producing in the West what he described as a state of spiritual exhaustion, leaving the West with a hunger they could not define nor satisfy because it lay outside the bounds of their imagination, which had been fenced in against any reality beyond the seemingly grim borders of their five senses. The Inklings are a group of individuals, and I'm including MacDonald and Chesterton in this, are those who affirm just the opposite of modernity's doctrine, and they decided to stand up and side with the majority of the story, that there was indeed a greater narrative. What they did was they gave back the Christian narrative in many ways, but most profoundly by re-dramatizing its fundamental truths through what Tolkien referred to as the ancient device of giving to them unfamiliar embodiments. Now note, the ancient device. These authors realized they were not doing anything new. They were just translators of reality as they understood it. And at the heart of that reality was this incredible myth that they referred to as the gospel. They re-mythologized the gospel. They created the way I've described it, a rational and imaginative space, and invited people into that space through their works. And then they bubbled them all over with what they understood to be the most essential things of what it means to be human. And I, for one, can attest to the fact that it felt good because I was drying up. Dorothy Sayers, in reflecting on Chesterton, said it this way: "To the young people of my generation, GKC was a kind of Christian liberator. Like a beneficent bomb, he blew out of the church a quantity of stained glass of a very poor period and let in gusts of fresh air in which the dead leaves of doctrine danced with all the indecorum of Our Lady's tumbler." Now, he did this through poetry, through detective fiction, through novels, through witty little essays. He re-enchanted our world, and he re-enchanted it under the guidelines of the narrative that he himself believed was true. What Chesterton came to realize is that as he became a believer, when that was late, that was just in the early part of the 20th century, he always had known that humanity had lost their way, as he said, but he had realized that now they had lost their address, and he was speaking specifically of the West, of Western Europe and North America. We don't even know where to write home to anymore. We don't have a story. And we're adrift. To come back to Tolkien for a moment, and the context in which he made that claim about ancient device, he says, I would claim, if I did not think it presumptuous in one so ill-instructed, to have as one object of what he did the elucidation of truth and the encouragement of good morals in this real world by the ancient device of exemplifying them in unfamiliar embodiments. That way they tend to bring them home. It's what Lewis called behind watchful, the past watchful dragons, this idea of trying to bring, in a sense, a certain reality that the world has come to be opposed to, and to bring it before them in a way in which they can be open to it. Because once we sense there's anything gospel about it, like Neil Gaiman, we shut down. And what's interesting, almost ironic, is that was Lewis's problem. And that is the very thing that Tolkien got Lewis over. In a letter to his boyhood friend Arthur Greaves, Lewis had said after this late night talk with Dyson and Tolkien, that he says, what they let me, help me understand is that if I got this notion of a dying God or a God sacrificing himself anywhere but the Gospels, I was open to it. I loved it. I'd let it nurture and nourish my soul. But once anything of Christianity came into it, I shut down. And what Tolkien helped me see is, no, the gospel itself is a myth. Itself is a meta-narrative. And in fact, it is the narrative, the meta-narrative, it is the myth by which all other myths find fulfillment. And Lewis had already come across this in Chesterton, because Chesterton says that if indeed Christianity is true, what we actually see in the human story is what we anticipate. If we come out of the garden with a promise, which we do find in Genesis 15, that it won't always be this way, that there will be another Adam, there will be another one who will come and heal the old wound and set it straight, then would we not expect that rumor, that promise, would then find its way in every civilization, every narrative in one form or another? Yes. As it moves away, of course, it becomes diffuse, but the seed of it remains. And in fact, if those aren't there, Chesterton says, then Christianity is wrong, because that's what we'd expect. But we'd also expect that if Christianity is true, then what the human story has been dreaming about all these years would indeed one day actually happen, actually become a historical fact. And that is what Christianity purports to do, to say, as Dorothy Sayers says, in this little piece of real estate in Palestine, when Quirinius was governor, God became a human being, sacrificed himself to himself for the sake of humanity. And she also says, and if you find that dull, then words have no meaning anymore. It's the most terrifying drama that's ever staggered the imagination of man. And it goes all the way back to the beginning, and it's being played out today in plays, in movies, in books, in various contexts. We can't get away from it. As Lewis says, we are by nature mythopathic. So what I'm suggesting is that one of the reasons for the enduring legacy of the Inklings, like so many authors that remain with us today, is they tapped in to something that is absolutely true about what it means to be human. Thank you.